January 23, 1943. Just after midnight. North Atlantic. The sky hung low like a sheet of iron, pressing darkness onto the waves. Oberleutnant See Karl Brenner stood on the conning tower of U-boat 356, his gloved hand wrapped around the frozen rail. Wind slashed across his face. Salt stung his eyes. The diesel engines pulsed faintly below his boots, a heartbeat he had trusted for years. He leaned forward into the night, scanning the horizon where no enemy lights had appeared for hours. The Atlantic was theirs. It always had been. He muttered to the watch officer beside him. The Americans still rely on clumsy depth charges. Loud, crude, impossible to aim. We will outlast them again. Confidence slid from his voice like smoke rising from the exhaust. What Karl Brenner did not know, what none of the U-boat crews cutting silently through those black waters could imagine, was that the Americans had unleashed a new weapon. A weapon that did not roar. A weapon that did not thunder. A weapon that did not warn. It entered the sea in silence and killed in silence. Only a handful of destroyer escorts carried it so far. Only a few Allied captains understood its rhythms. But within months, it would cut into the heart of the U-boat arm. It would reverse the mathematics of the Atlantic War. Brenner lowered his binoculars. Somewhere far off, unseen in the dark, a small American ship practiced with a strange cluster of forward-thrown projectiles that German engineers had dismissed as childish. Useless. A toy. They had laughed at the Hedgehog. Within the year, no one aboard a U-boat would laugh again. The enemy Brenner had mocked would soon be the enemy he feared most. And the silent splashes that would one day surround his submarine would mark the beginning of the end for the hunters of the Atlantic. The bitter cold of that January night did not begin to explain why Karl Brenner felt so certain of victory. His confidence had been built over years, shaped by orders from Admiral Donitz, by charts thick with sunken ships, by patrol logs that read like triumph after triumph across the wide Atlantic. Since the beginning of 1942, U-boats had torn through Allied convoys with devastating efficiency. In the period the Germans later called their second happy time, they sank merchant ships at a rate no navy had ever imagined possible. In a single month, Allied losses reached well over 500,000 tons. Entire convoys burned on the horizon as Brenner watched from his periscope, believing the sea itself bowed to the wolfpacks. He had reason to believe it. The U-boat arm had expanded relentlessly. From barely a few dozen operational submarines in the early war, Germany now deployed well over 100 boats each month, stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Caribbean. Donitz's signals to his commanders carried a tone of near mathematical certainty. He wrote that the enemy is exhausted. Their industry cannot replace losses at this tempo. Victory at sea is only a matter of pressure and endurance. Brenner copied that line into his own notebook. He believed it fully. Depth charges fit the narrative. They were loud, predictable. They gave U-boat crews seconds or even minutes to evade. A watch officer could hear the launch, feel the rhythm of the charges falling through the water, and brace before the explosion. Survival was part skill, part luck, and part instinct. But the danger felt manageable. Brenner had survived more than 20 attacks in his career. He joked that depth charges were more frightening to the fish than to him. This confidence made the contrast with American preparations all the sharper. By the end of 1942, the United States had begun reshaping the Atlantic War with a scale Germany had never accounted for. Convoys that once scattered in panic now traveled behind screens of destroyers and corvettes. New escort carriers prowled the shipping lanes, aircraft circling like watchful hawks. Sonar was improving every month. Radar sets, once unreliable in heavy seas, had gained new centimetric clarity. What Brenner did not yet know was that the Americans had already identified the fatal flaw in traditional anti-submarine warfare. Depth charges exploded behind a submarine, often after it had already slipped away. They shook the hull, but rarely hit. Statistically, Only one attack in many dozens produced a kill. The problem was geometry. The weapon detonated in the wrong place. American engineers had searched for a solution. A weapon that attacked not behind the submarine, but ahead of the ship. A weapon that created a pattern across the predicted interception point. A weapon that exploded only on contact, eliminating the chaos of blind detonations. Their trials showed a sharp rise in success rates. Not double, not triple, far more. An American captain later wrote in his training log, "We can now strike where the target will be, not where it was." For the first time, predictability favors us. These words revealed what German commanders refused to accept. The Allies were no longer reacting. They were innovating. The industrial weight of the United States, once dismissed as irrelevant across an ocean, was now being forged into weapons Germany had never considered possible. Brenner's world still operated under old assumptions. He believed Allied escorts were clumsy. He believed their aim was guesswork. He believed Americans lacked the finesse to operate advanced anti-submarine tactics. His instructors had repeated it endlessly. The enemy is large but slow, wealthy but crude, courageous but undisciplined. But beneath that surface of confidence, the foundation was already cracking. American shipyards launched new escorts faster than Germany could replace lost submarines. Every month brought more vessels equipped with sonar that reached deeper and farther than earlier sets. Radio intelligence, once intermittent, began to map out wolfpack movements with unsettling precision. The vast distances of the Atlantic, once an ally to the U-boats, were shrinking under the pressure of relentless Allied coordination. Still, Brenner trusted the mathematics he had been taught. Submarines required stealth, nerve, and patience. Depth charges required luck. The balance favored him. Yet the pattern was shifting. By late 1942, the Admiralty quietly recorded a rise in submarine kills. Not from depth charges alone, but from a new class of forward-fired weapons that produced no sound when they entered the sea. No echo, no roar, only the sudden, final crush of a submarine hull. The Hedgehog had begun its silent work. And though only a handful of American ships carried it at first, the trend was unmistakable. Kill percentages rose sharply. German DU headquarters noticed the rise in U-boat losses but attributed it to Allied numerical growth, not weapons innovation. Donitz dismissed rumors of new technology as enemy propaganda. It would be months before he understood the truth. In that cold winter of 1943, Brenner still believed he understood every threat the enemy could bring. He believed the depth charge was the final form of anti-submarine warfare. He did not yet know that the new threat made no noise. He did not yet know that survival instincts born from old weapons no longer applied. And he did not know that in the span of a single year, the ocean would change from a hunting ground into a graveyard for the U-boat arm. The first hint that something had changed came quietly, almost too quietly for Karl Brenner to notice. It happened in late February 1943 during a routine patrol southwest of Iceland. The sea was rough, the kind of rolling gray water that normally kept escorts at a distance. Brenner took comfort in that. Poor visibility favored the hunters. Shortly after dawn, the sonar operator reported faint propeller screws approaching fast. Brenner ordered the boat down to deeper water, confident the usual dance would unfold. The escorts would drop a spread of depth charges, the ocean would convulse with thunder, and U-356 would slip away through the turbulence. It was a rhythm Brenner knew like breathing. But the rhythm broke. The first salvo of depth charges fell far off the mark. The explosions rumbled through the hull, shaking dust from the overhead piping. Crew members exchanged familiar grins. Another clumsy attack. Another easy escape. Then the second attack came. The soundman lifted his head sharply. He heard splashes. Many splashes. But there were no detonations. No rising roar. No sense of descending steel barrels. Only quick, light impacts on the surface above them, like pebbles thrown into a pond. Brenner frowned. He turned to the watch officer. Did they misfire? Their depth charges are silent now. The watch officer shook his head. Depth charges do not behave like that. They never have. The splashes continued for several seconds, falling in a precise rhythm. Then silence. Absolute silence. The boat drifted, engines at low revolutions, every man listening for what he expected to come next. But nothing came. No blast wave. No shock ring through the pressure hull. No tearing sound as the ocean itself was pulled apart by explosives. The crew grew uneasy. Silence was not normal. Silence meant unpredictability. Silence meant they did not understand the threat. Brenner steadied himself on the chart table. He reviewed the possibilities. Perhaps the escort had lost contact. Perhaps the sea state had confused their sonar. Perhaps they were firing some new type of illumination flare or marking device. He dismissed the idea almost instantly. No one would fire marking charges underwater in an attack run. Then a darker thought pressed against the edge of his mind. Could they have developed a weapon that only exploded on impact? If so, they would never hear a missed shot. Only the one that hit. He said nothing. Doubt was a disease that spread too easily on a submarine. In the control room, the young engineer muttered, "If they have found a way to make silent depth charges, how do we know when to brace?" The question hung in the stale air. No one answered. Meanwhile, on the surface above them, aboard the American destroyer-escort USS Eldridge, the scene looked very different. Lieutenant James Alden, the ship's weapons officer, leaned over the rail with a satisfied grin. He watched the Hedgehog projectiles arc cleanly into the air before striking the sea in a tight, elliptical pattern. Each projectile carried a contact fuse. Only a direct hit on the submarine would trigger detonation. Misses vanished into the deep without noise. For the first time in the war, Alden's crew could track the target through sonar without losing the echo in their own explosive wash. In training trials, Hedgehog had already demonstrated a remarkable improvement in kill probability. Traditional depth charges succeeded only once in many dozens of attacks. Hedgehog's contact-fused warheads produced success rates several times higher. The Americans had quietly solved the geometry that had protected Brenner's kind for years. Alden's log entry later read, "The silence of the weapon is its greatest strength. The enemy never knows if the shot failed. They only know when it succeeds." Back below, Brenner felt the weight of uncertainty. The ocean around him no longer behaved according to the rules he had mastered. A veteran commander, shaped by years of predictable combat, now faced something unfamiliar, something invisible. The boat surfaced hours later, after the enemy gave up the chase. But the mood aboard U-356 had changed. The men did not cheer their escape. They whispered instead. They asked each other what they had heard, or rather, what they had not heard. That quiet encounter did not sink the submarine, but it planted a thought that grew like rust in Brenner's mind. Something new was hunting them. Something that did not roar. Something that did not warn. He tried to rationalize it away. Perhaps the escort crew panicked. Perhaps they misjudged depth. Perhaps this was an isolated misfire. But the ocean was not finished with its warnings. In the weeks that followed, more U-boats reported the same strange attacks. Splashes without detonations. Sonar pings followed by eerie silence. It was as though the enemy had begun firing ghosts into the water. And each time, one more submarine failed to report back to headquarters. The pattern was forming, even if Brenner and his comrades refused to admit it. The first cracks in U-boat supremacy had opened. They would soon widen into a chasm. The splashes kept returning. By early spring of 1943, the U-boat arm began to notice a pattern buried inside the daily loss reports. Boats were vanishing under circumstances that defied the familiar logic of depth charge warfare. Donitz headquarters received signals from patrol lines that ended abruptly, without the usual frantic last messages or emergency surfacing attempts. Submarines were simply erased. Karl Brenner read the dispatches during a brief resupply at sea. The radio operator handed him a thin stack of encoded sheets. Brenner scanned the figures once, then again. 7 boats lost in 10 days. 4 of them without any sign of distress. 2 others last reported being hunted by small American escorts. Brenner closed the folder slowly. The Atlantic had grown more dangerous every year, but this felt different. Losses usually came in spikes when Allied task groups concentrated their strength. But these new sinkings were scattered across thousands of miles. Different convoys, different patrol sectors, different weather. The only common factor was silence. No explosion signatures detected. No prolonged attacks. No crew survivors found. The ocean no longer thundered when a submarine died. It whispered. A week later, U-356 encountered the new threat again. Brenner was tracking a convoy south of Greenland when sonar reported an approaching escort. The watch officer called out range numbers as he marked the bearing on the plotting table. The submarine began a slow dive to evade detection. Then the splashes returned. A series of bright, crisp impacts on the surface above them. No roar. No rolling shock waves. No booming detonations from depth charges tumbling down the water column. Only the delicate rainfall of contact-fused warheads slicing into the sea. The crew stiffened. Brenner felt the same cold ripple of fear he had tried to ignore weeks earlier. His instincts screamed at him to brace, but for what there was no pattern to anticipate, no rhythm to count, no rising thunder to warn of impact. The attack might already have missed, or it might be seconds away from striking the hull. He felt the weight of every eye on him. "Hold depth," he ordered. "Engines 1/4. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. For the second time, the submarine survived, but the crew no longer celebrated. The silence of missed shots was more frightening than explosions. An explosion meant the enemy was wrong. Silence meant they might be exactly right, but only inches off. Brenner made a note in his personal log. The Americans may possess a forward-thrown weapon. It behaves unlike depth charges. Silence may indicate contact only. If this is true, our traditional evasion methods are obsolete. He did not show the note to his officers. Across the ocean, the Allies were experiencing the opposite emotion. Confidence, rising fast and rising loud. On board USS Frederick C. Davis, Lieutenant Commander Howard King stood on the bridge after conducting a Hedgehog attack that ended with a narrow plume of dark oil rising from the sea. He wrote in his after-action report, "The sonar echo dissolved instantly. The depth was shallow. We believe the submarine broke apart in moments." This was consistent with Hedgehog's effect, because the weapon exploded only upon directly striking a submarine. Its blasts were far more lethal than the dispersed pressure waves of depth charges. Submarines hit by Hedgehog often suffered catastrophic hull failure in seconds. Technically, the reason was simple. A depth charge exploding several meters away exerted a force that dissipated rapidly. A Hedgehog strike detonated against the pressure hull, transmitting the full energy directly into steel and rivets not designed to withstand that kind of concentrated impact. The Americans refined their tactics quickly. Sonar operators learned to keep the target in continuous track. Ships advanced directly toward predicted positions. Hedgehog patterns blanketed the interception point. For the first time in the war, escorts were attacking not where the submarine had been moments prior, but exactly where it was heading. Kill probabilities soared. The British ran comparative studies between older depth charge attacks and the new Hedgehog system. The numbers were unequivocal. Metric American Hedgehog German U-boat. Detection to engagement time shortened dramatically, increasingly insufficient. Kill probability per attack several times higher, falling sharply. Monthly U-boat losses rising, unsustainable. The numbers whispered what morale could not yet admit. The Atlantic was shifting. Meanwhile, U-boat radiomen listened to lost signals from other wolfpacks with growing dread. A radioman aboard U-423 wrote in his diary, "Boats do not die like this. There is no struggle, no fight, only disappearance." One of Donitz's staff officers, an analytical mind named Kessler, reviewed the same lost data and said in a briefing, These are not conventional depth charge signatures. Something new is at work. Something the enemy has not revealed. But Donitz refused to believe. He blamed Allied air patrols. He blamed weather. He blamed navigational errors. Anything except a technological shift he had not anticipated. By mid-1943, Brenner finally understood what his superiors would not say out loud. The hunters had become the hunted. Each patrol grew more dangerous than the last. The ocean that once felt limitless now felt full of invisible tripwires. The confidence that fueled the U-boat arm for years began to drain away, replaced by a quiet dread. A dread that took the shape of those strange splashes falling silently from above. Brenner no longer dismissed them as misfires. He no longer believed the Americans lacked discipline. He no longer trusted the old mathematics of submarine warfare. Something new was stalking the deep. Something that erased ships without sound. Something that struck with a precision no German commander had imagined possible. The mounting evidence was undeniable. And soon, Brenner would face the ultimate demonstration of its power. By the summer of 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had transformed into something unrecognizable to the veterans who had once ruled it. The hunter packs that prowled confidently across the ocean in the early war now moved like shadows pressed against the edges of a battlefield they no longer understood. For Karl Brenner, the transformation would reveal its full and devastating truth on a gray morning in July. U-356 had been tracking a large convoy moving northeast toward the British Isles. The weather was calm, the sky low and heavy, and visibility favored a submerged approach. Brenner studied the convoy's pattern through the periscope before clouds swept in, erasing the silhouettes of the distant merchant ships. He lowered the scope and nodded to his weapons officer. "We will trail them until nightfall. Then we strike." It was the strategy that had carried the U-boat arm through its years of dominance. But dominance was gone, and Brenner knew it. Still, strategy meant routine, and routine helped him push aside the dread that had settled inside him after months of strange silent attacks. The sonar operator stiffened suddenly. Escort approaching fast. Bearing steady. Brenner moved to the chart table. He began marking the enemy's bearing, expecting the familiar slow turn of a destroyer sweeping the outer edge of the convoy. But the American ship was not sweeping. It was driving directly toward them with purpose. He recognized the danger instantly. "They have full contact on us." He ordered an immediate dive to deeper water, engines low, but the margin was already narrowing. The escort closed the distance with unnerving precision. This was not the clumsy chase of earlier years. This was a predator moving with certainty. Then came the splashes. Not a few. Dozens. Falling in a clean elliptical pattern, each one a quiet whisper on the surface above them. The crew froze. No one spoke. No one breathed. The terror was immediate and suffocating. The sonar echo held steady for only a moment longer before the operator shouted, "Lost contact, they have fired." The Hedgehog pattern descended through the water, the warheads gliding silently toward their predicted interception point. Still no explosions. Still no thunder. Still no warning. The crushing realization spread across every face in the control room. The men could not tell if the pattern had missed, if it had struck, or if the next seconds would bring the end. Then it happened. A single, sharp detonation tore through the water. Not the rolling thunder of depth charges. Not the long, drawn-out pressure wave. This was different. Sudden, direct, focused. It slammed into the hull like a hammer blow. The lights flickered. A pipe split open above the engineer's station. The submarine lurched as seawater sprayed across the control room. Brenner grabbed the rail to steady himself. That was a direct strike. A second detonation followed almost instantly, striking near the aft compartment. Metal groaned under the sudden shock. Something deep inside the pressure hull began to buckle. Men shouted over the roar of rushing water. Brenner ordered all pumps engaged, but he knew it was futile. A Hedgehog strike did not simply damage a U-boat. It broke it. It hit the one place where submarines were weakest, the hull itself. There was no buffer, no distance, no cushion of water to absorb the blow. Above them, aboard the American destroyer-escort USS Francis M. Robinson, Lieutenant Commander Nicholas Devereux observed the sonar screen as the echo weakened, fluttered, and then dissolved entirely. He turned to his crew. "That is a kill, no doubt." His report later noted, contact vanished immediately at shallow depth. Oil and debris surfaced within minutes. Single and double detonations consistent with direct hull penetration. Below the waves, U-356 was dying. The aft compartments flooded first. The boat began to tilt. Men clung to valves, to bulkhead ladders, to anything that gave them balance. The silence between detonations felt worse than the blasts themselves. It meant more strikes might be coming. It meant the enemy had fired enough warheads to blanket every escape vector. Brenner steadied himself at the central junction. He looked at the faces around him. The fear was raw, quiet, absolute. The men who once whispered proudly of their victories now whispered prayers. Another detonation struck the midsection. The hull groaned like a wounded animal. The lights flickered out. Darkness swallowed the control room. In that moment, Brenner understood the full truth of what the silent attacks meant. Depth charges were blind weapons of chance. This was not chance. This was precision. This was mathematics shaped by industrial might and scientific rigor. This was democracy manufacturing more ingenuity than authoritarianism could ever match. The submarine tilted again. Alarms screamed into the darkness. Men struggled to seal bulkheads, but already the forward compartment was taking on water. A memory flashed through Brenner's mind. The words he had once spoken on the conning tower months before. Americans still rely on clumsy depth charges. He felt the irony cut deeper than the seawater rising around his boots. Far above, the surface of the Atlantic barely rippled. There was no thunderous plume to mark the submarine's final descent. Only a spreading sheen of oil and a few pieces of shattered plating bobbing on the waves. Post-war, one German survivor from another Hedgehog strike described the experience in stark terms. You hear nothing. You know nothing. Then your world breaks apart in an instant. It was the perfect description of the weapon that ended the U-boat's reign. The climax of Brenner's story was simple and devastating. The silence that had once sheltered him now belonged to his enemy. And the ocean he thought he had mastered had become the quiet executioner of the submarine arm. When the war in the Atlantic finally tilted beyond recovery for Germany, few understood the shift as clearly as the officers who had lived beneath the waves. The transformation had not come with a single battle or a single breakthrough. It had come through a new kind of weapon, a quiet weapon, one that erased the very advantages submarines had relied upon since their birth. The Hedgehog did not roar. It did not churn the sea into chaos. It simply struck directly and decisively and changed the outcome of the war. In the months following the loss of U-356, the statistics painted a story clearer than any interpretation. Before the introduction of the Hedgehog, Allied anti-submarine attacks had a success rate counted in single percentages, often requiring dozens of depth charge runs to produce even one sinking. After Hedgehog deployment, kill probabilities climbed sharply, sometimes reaching several times the effectiveness of traditional depth charges. Monthly U-boat losses rose to levels Germany could not sustain. The ocean that had once been a battlefield of patience had become a grid of hunted corridors. By late 1944, the average lifespan of a newly commissioned U-boat had shrunk to mere weeks. Some survived only days. Others disappeared without transmitting a single message. Donitz, reviewing the final year's lost charts after the war, wrote simply, "The enemy gained mastery through methods we could not match." It was as much an admission of defeat as any surrender. Few German officers spoke openly about the psychological effects of the new American weapons, but private diaries revealed a truth that official reports concealed. The silence was the worst part. There was no roar to brace against. no rhythm of falling charges to predict. A crew could not tell if they had escaped or if death was already seconds away. The emotional resilience that had carried submariners through years of brutal combat evaporated under the weight of that uncertainty. Among the survivors, the memory remained vivid. One wrote years later, "With depth charges you felt hope. With Hedgehog, there was only waiting for the moment the hull would fail." American reports described the weapon in different terms. They spoke of precision, efficiency, and tactical evolution. They described how ships no longer lost sonar contact in their own explosions. They spoke of forward-fired patterns that let escorts strike directly at predicted paths. They wrote with growing confidence as convoy losses dropped and Allied control of the Atlantic strengthened. The contrast revealed the deeper truth of the conflict. Germany, confident in early war success, had relied on doctrine and tradition. The United States, forced into a corner at the start, had turned to innovation, production, and relentless problem-solving. One side believed it had perfected submarine warfare. The other believed nothing was ever perfect and improvement never ended. After the war, fragments of U-356 were never recovered. The wreck rests somewhere beneath the gray Atlantic, another entry in the quiet list of submarines lost with all hands. For Karl Brenner, there were no memoirs, no interviews, no final reflections. His voice ended in the silence that defined his last battle. But the legacy of his story remains. It recalls a moment when the battlefield shifted not because of bravado, ideology, or even courage, but because of a simple truth. Free societies can outthink the systems that try to dominate them. They can build faster, learn faster, and adapt faster than regimes anchored in rigid hierarchy and unquestioned doctrine. Democracies generate innovation not by command, but by curiosity. The Hedgehog was proof of that. A quiet invention that spoke volumes. A small cluster of projectiles that carried with them the weight of an entire nation's industrial might and intellectual power. A weapon that signaled a turning point not only in the Atlantic War, but in the modern understanding of technological adaptation. The callback to that cold January night becomes unmistakable. Brenner had stared across a dark ocean, believing he understood every danger that might rise from it. He trusted the mathematics of war as he knew them. Yet, within months, the ocean carried a new and silent truth. The weapon Germany mocked had become the weapon it feared most. And the sea they once believed belonged to them now belonged to the quiet precision of Allied innovation. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was not decided by noise or thunder. It was decided by the stillness that followed each silent plunge of a Hedgehog round. It was decided by an idea shaped into steel, guided by sonar, and propelled by the determination of a democracy unwilling to surrender the seas. The submariners of the early war believed they hunted in darkness. But in the final years, it was the darkness that hunted them.